Hello everyone. This is Brian and Lee calling in from Shanghai, and we're very excited for today's webinar. I would just ask and remind everybody to stay muted for the duration of the call. If you have any questions, you can throw them into the chat group. Thank you, Mino, and Xiangyan for messaging already. We'll be looking at the chat box throughout the call, and we'll answer the questions during the Q&A session at the very end. In just a moment, I will start sharing our screen, and then you'll see our keynote presentation. So let's get started. Welcome to the webinar. We'll be talking about opportunities in Asia. We are based in China, and so we know China, personally. But we'll be also touching on opportunities in Asia in general and some of the macro and micro trends that are happening right now. Just a bit of background. My name is Brian. This is Lee. We both work at RADII, based out of Shanghai here. We've both worked at many different startups in China and have worked in different industries. I've worked in blockchain tech and education and now media. And Lee?
Hey guys, once again, thank you so much for making time to hang out with us on your Saturday. I have been at RADII now for around a year, and before this, I also worked for an education startup, and which was part of the Alibaba ecosystem. I'm sure most of you guys know Alibaba, at least I hope you do. I'm Chinese. I spent most of my life growing up in the UK, and then I came back to Shanghai about 5 years ago because I realized that this is really becoming the heart of the world. So yeah, I have so much I want to share with you today. So thanks again for taking time.
All right, so just to give you an overview of what to expect for today, we'll be going through why people come to China, what are the most exciting industries that are growing quickly here, the logistics of moving here, including visa and housing, all the things that you'd have to, all the hurdles you have to come over if this is the first time moving to China. Number 4 would be cross-cultural communication, so how to anticipate and deal with some of the challenges you might face when interacting with people from a different culture. And then finally, next steps, what are things that we can do to educate ourselves as we move forward?
Right, so for those of you guys who have never heard of RADII before, RADII is about capturing voices of young China. This is an incredible opportunity for the next wave, the next generation of China to be heard by people like you guys. I'm sure every single one of you use social media and watch the news. Therefore, you know that China is not always represented in such a comprehensive way. Lots of nuances of China is often lost in traditional media. So what RADII tries to do is share with the world that young people here are just as interested in LGBTQ, in punk music, in being vegetarians, exploring aspects of culture, just like their counterparts outside of China. And that connection, that bridge is what we're trying to achieve here. So as a media company, of course, it's important for us to be picked up by mainstream media. Meanwhile, we have social media platforms, we have our own platform. We reach around 1 million individuals a week with our content. And yeah, if you haven't really checked us out before, I would encourage you to do so.
So one of the ways that Lee and I help at RADII, we have a team of 15 full-time here in China, and then we also have a network of about 30 contributors who write to us from all over the world. And Lee and I, we ourselves are not journalists or writers by training, but what we do is we help organizations, businesses, big corporates, to help them understand what's happening in China, especially from the angle of youth and innovation. China is a place where I'm sure all of you know is where a lot of technology is being developed. It's where a lot of exciting companies are coming out of here. And we're trying to help basically interpret all of these new trends for a global audience. And one of the big macro level things happening is, of course, the coronavirus. China was the first country to be hit by it, and then it soon spread to other countries. And so back in March and April, we were reporting a lot on this story. And China has not been immune to some of the negative impacts. This story from April, we reported that there were 5 million people who had lost jobs, and now that's closer to 25 million. That being said, China is also a bright spot. In Shanghai, where we are, things have already been reopened for about a month and a half now. That includes businesses, and now schools are back open. New daily cases are in the single digits. So we feel like things are safe and slowly getting back to normal. There are bright spots in terms of new jobs. So, and that's something that we want to talk about today. For example, in China, something that's very popular is millions of people are becoming these delivery drivers, people who are sending meals back and forth between restaurants and clients. And I think here it says that, one delivery service added 336,000 new drivers in the past 2 months. So, there are certain services that are really exploding these days. And then during the recent 2 sessions meeting, the biggest sort of government meeting in Beijing this year, which happened last week, they announced that they would be helping to create 9 million new jobs this year. So China is, has not been immune to the effects of the coronavirus, but they are certainly committed to providing new opportunities for its citizens. One of the things that RADII did when this story first broke was to kind of hit the streets and really see what local people were feeling. One thing that we observe mainstream media struggles a lot with is that they talk about China as if it's just the government or it's just one big country. And while those things are important, we feel it's very important to actually talk to people on the streets and really hear how they've been affected by the news, especially with the coronavirus. So I'll show a little example of this. Just a brief little clip.
We're out and about on the streets, and we want to hear from people who are still working to see how the epidemic has affected their life and their work. And this is what the people of Shanghai has to say.
单量基本上很少，去年这个时候平均应该是50-60单吧，现在的话应该平均一天也就是20多单的样子，
相当于一半的量都没有了。
对啊，好多人不敢点，也怕传染啊。
那你老家是哪里的？
我山西的。
那你准备就是过了年之后再回家吗？
暂时不考虑。
So yeah, that clip was back in the end of January, so just before Chinese New Year, and that's a perspective that we think is very important to tell. What do Chinese people actually feel, and what are their stories? That's something that we're trying to fill the gap in when talking about China on a global stage. Now, I wanted to ask the question of why China. So it's funny because I might look Chinese to some of you. I'm actually Korean American, and I came to China first six years ago. And everybody that, all of my friends back in the US would ask me, why would you go to China? And I thought that was a kind of a funny question to ask. And I identified, 3 main reasons why people would come to China. The first one's probably tourism and culture. If you read any of these books, I highly recommend them. They talk about China in many different ways. The first one, Age of Ambition, talks about what are the dreams and hopes of young Chinese people now. A lot of the narratives that come about out of China, some of the stereotypes that China's full of, copycats and fake luxury goods, or that China's full of pollution. These things still exist in China, but China's come a long way since that narrative. Maybe that's already been, it's probably 20 or 30 years old now. Kissinger's book on China does a good job of talking about, especially, how China and the West relate to each other. So that's helpful to get some of the historical context. But I think that books like the Evan Osno's book, Age of Ambition, do a much better job of telling what does modern China look like? What does China look like in 2020? For those of you who don't know, China is a very diverse place. There's 34 provincial level areas that include 56 different ethnic minorities. So when we talk about the Chinese people, you're actually talking about 56 different groups. And each of the provinces has their own culture, their own politics, their own businesses. And so one of the things that you realize when you first come to China is that it's a very big, very diverse place. And even two first-tier cities like Beijing and Shanghai, they kind of have a very intense rivalry. They don't like each other very much. So I think when you come here for tourism, that's one of the first things you might notice is when you visit different cities, there are many different faces of China. The next reason you might come to China is for the academics. And that could be something like learning Chinese. So if you're somebody who has an interest in learning Chinese beyond just, what you might use as a tourist, then I highly recommend some of the resources on the right here. So Hacking Chinese is a blog dedicated to, hacking the process of learning Chinese. Chairman's Bao and Do Chinese are online apps where you can read Chinese language material that's graded down to sort of beginners and teaches you how pronunciation, etc. One of the programs that I did was a language boot camp, and that was at National Taiwan University at a program called ICLP. At a program like that, you'll be spending at least 4 hours a day in intensive classes. You're not allowed to speak English, you can only use Chinese. And within 3 months, I was able to get through 1 year's worth of college level Chinese. And after a year, I was able to read and write fluently and give presentations, read the newspaper, things like that. So that's one way to learn Chinese. And then, of course, China Admissions. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with their work. They do tremendous work working with Chinese universities and helping people study abroad there. So actually, right after our webinar, there's a webinar hosted by Zhejiang University about their business school. And China Admissions in general, you can go to their website to look at more resources on how to identify the right program for you to help you come to China. And I should also mention there's a lot of scholarships available. So whether it's going to mainland China or Taiwan, usually the government will have a lot of scholarships to help fund those programs. Moving on, so for career, there is a lot of different ways to advance your career in China. And actually, did I skip a, maybe? So there's, oh, sorry, I messed up the order here. So China is a very exciting place to pursue your career right now. In terms of career development opportunities, especially if you're looking at tech, there are tens of thousands of jobs opening up despite the coronavirus. And part of that's due to the fact that people are reliant on these technology solutions to do their work now. So a firm like Alibaba, for example, has software called DingTalk. This is the equivalent of maybe Slack in the West. Something like that has been used by pretty much all companies now. Tencent, of course, produces Wechat, another popular social media app. And so if you're in the technology space, they're hiring tens of thousands of jobs right now. And a lot of these jobs are actually in their global offices. So for example, ByteDance, they're the parent company of TikTok. They have a headquarters in America, in Los Angeles, and they're hiring for many positions there right now. So just to continue on with tech, this is an area where China is really innovating. Most of you probably know that the traditional Western companies of Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, they're all blocked in China. You can't view them easily. And so China has its own tech infrastructure. So instead of, Amazon Web Services, you would use Alibaba's cloud services. In gaming, Tencent is a huge juggernaut. They probably own, most of the world's largest game developers, and they're continuing to invest in this area quite a bit. For e-commerce, Amazon shut its doors, I think last year or maybe in 2018. And basically, Alibaba, Jingdong, Pinduoduo, Meituan have really dominated this space. They do trillions of dollars in terms of gross merchandise value. And if it's something that you're interested in, again, they're the ones hiring the most during this epidemic. For social media, QQ and WeChat have been the dominant players for chat and messaging. I think WeChat has something like 1.2 billion active users. So all of China plus all of the Chinese abroad. It really is a dominant part of daily life here. Of course, Douyin, or TikTok, as it's known outside of China, is another new phenomenon that's reached more than 1 billion users, and it's growing very quickly. And then the fourth area I wanted to mention is just AI and big data. So that's something that I'm sure all of you have heard of as well, the Chinese surveillance state, or the ability for the Chinese government to access a lot of data. One of the things that people abroad will ask me is, don't you feel concerned, or don't you feel scared about privacy issues? That's a conversation that people don't really talk about as much here, just because it's been a part of the Chinese state, for the past 60 years. And of course, when it comes to big data, China has used a lot of that data for a lot of good. We've seen, extremely low crime rates. When the virus broke out, the government was able to track people's movements and make sure that people were maintaining quarantine. And so that was a big reason why China was able to reduce the cases of the virus, just because the government knew if you were violating your quarantine. And so now if we want to enter any building or a restaurant, you often have to show this proof, this health code that proves that you are healthy and fit to enter those spaces. And lastly, startups. So I'm not sure how many of you are entrepreneurs or thinking about starting your own company. There's lots of opportunities and support for those types of people. So if you're at the early stage and you're looking for VC funding, then something like China Accelerator would be a really good option. They've been around for 10 years already. And I think the largest accelerator in China with quite an amount of financial backing from global investors. If you're looking for more corporate acceleration, or if you just need a co-working space, something like Xnode, WeWork and WeWork Labs, those are examples of organizations you could reach out to help get a start. And then for hardware acceleration, so I'm not sure if you've heard of the city Shenzhen, which is right across the border from Hong Kong. Shenzhen is sort of the tech capital, and they really do a great job in both software and hardware. And so they have, we've seen a lot of hardware accelerators come out of Shenzhen. So if you want to develop a medical device or a new electric scooter, Shenzhen would be the very best place in the world to head to.
Education. Yep.
Let's go back really quick. Okay, and I want to just touch on education really quickly. So a lot of you might be interested in teaching or other types of education opportunities, working in that industry, which is a huge industry in China. Something like 600,000 Chinese will study abroad in different countries. They invest billions and billions of dollars into pursuing education. So a lot of these companies that I'm going to talk about right now are very large ones and well established. For offline teaching opportunities, if you want to teach at a traditional school, something like Dulwich College or the Harrow School, these are old British, boarding schools that have opened up in China, and they have campuses all over in Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and other smaller cities. For test prep, that's helping students study for the SATs or the GREs. Xindongfang or New Oriental is a publicly listed company of the New York Stock Exchange. They're a very large company, and they're open in every single city in China. So that would be a great place to get a part-time or full-time job. For college counseling, this is helping those 600,000 students apply for universities abroad. You would work through an agency like IVUN. They're basically agencies that help these families navigate that complicated process of applying to schools abroad. And then if you can't come into China but are still looking to teach, then there are lots of new online platforms. So the biggest one for English language education is called VIP Kid. I think now they must have almost 100,000 teachers on the platform, and millions of students in China use these online courses. So that would be a great way to take on a part-time online job. And then if you're looking for other opportunities, you can look through the job boards. So the ones, if you speak Chinese, then the best ones would be Boss-Zhipin or Liepin. If you don't speak Chinese, then you probably want to stick with LinkedIn, maybe Glassdoor, and look for Chinese companies that are based in China. So let's move on to logistics of how to, if you want to move here, once you get a job, how do you get there? And Lee's going to cover this part.
Thanks, Brian. So Brian did all the exciting stuff about what's happening in China, and I'm going to go through the slightly more boring stuff of how do you actually get started with your job? I've gone through this experience quite a few times, given that I'm Chinese, but I've offered quite a few jobs out to people at the company. So I'm going to speak to you guys with about a lot of these details, and hopefully I can help you. So first of all, about visa. Look, there's a lot of information out there on Google. You can just type it in and it will tell you about how to get a work visa and how to get into the point system. But what I can say is not every single company has the capabilities of offering you a visa. That's very, very important. Unless you're going to go for one of the big ones that Brian mentioned earlier, ByteDance, Alibaba, Tencent, and hey, you should be. But in case you are not that corporate person and you want to go for a creative agency, you want to work for a startup, you got to check. Always check. The best way to check is to say, hey, have you offered visas to a foreigner before? How long has that foreigner now been working at your company for? Did you transition their visa from student to a work visa successfully? That conversation means so much, especially for a local startup who think the process is easy. And let me tell you, it is not. It is very, very expensive. On average, per visa for a foreigner costs the company around $5,000 USD. What this means is that for a lot of companies, you might find a clause in your contract that says if you leave the company early, you may have to pay back a certain percentage of that visa cost. Please check your contract to make sure you understand what you're getting yourself into before you sign on the dotted line. It's also important for you to remember that the visa system right now states that unless you have studied in China, you must have a minimum of 2 years of work experience. This is something that is always changing and companies respond to it differently. So make sure you are having that conversation with HR and you bug them to get that clear, structured information down on paper before your move. So that's the first thing. Now, let's talk about housing. Again, I don't really want to tell you things that you can find on Google. Of course, there are so many different platforms and agencies you can use to get housing. What I do want to say is, one, there are a lot of companies in China that will include housing as part of their work contract. Because for a lot of companies in China, they can expense the housing costs for their employees for tax benefits. So when you are negotiating your contract, it's always a great idea to ask, hey, is this part of the plan? Have you done this for other people before? If I'm the first foreigner, would you be considering doing this for me? If the answer is yes, your company will indeed include housing as part of your package. When you are finding an apartment in one of the cities in China, you have to make sure that your landlord can provide you with a piece of paper that is accepted by the local government as an expense form. Of course, when you get here, this is called fapiao. This is something that's everybody in China has heard of and talks about all the time, but you need to make sure that that is available to you. One very important thing for me to mention is that I do not personally recommend for you to sign for a house before you get here. Why? Because Shanghai is constantly changing. Every single street corner you go onto, you see, is being gentrified. I don't know necessarily what it's like in Beijing and Shenzhen, but I can imagine it sometimes can be very similar. What this means is that it's not enough to drop a pin on Google Maps and say, hey, I'm gonna have a look around. This looks nice. It's got a nice cafe. I'll take it. The likelihood is when you get here, it looks entirely different. So that's something to bear in mind if you are thinking about moving and you want to think about housing options. Finally, this is very important as well, is make sure that before you sign a contract and you pay a deposit for your house, that the local agents provide you with the information for you to register as a foreigner at the local police station. In order for you to maintain your work visa, in order for you to travel and have a long career in China, registering is extremely, extremely important. And not all of the agents will go out of their way to help you. So before you hand over your dollar, make sure you get that done. Okay, next part, salary negotiation. I've sat across the table quite a few times for salary negotiation. And the first thing that I need to tell you guys is, in China, there's a huge difference between the gross, which is the number that is written on your contract, and the net, which is how much you actually take home. This is very important when you are thinking about a full-time job in China, especially for any of you guys out there who are perhaps Chinese and graduating from a university right now and you tuned in today. Guys, do not overlook this issue. A lot of companies have to pay usually 40% extra on top of your salary to the local governments as part of social insurance. And this money is often included in your contract. So make a note of this, gross versus net. I will check before I sign a contract. The second thing is that for most Chinese companies, it's very standard to give you 5 days of holiday. I know, guys, it's not a lot. In fact, it's minimal. However, I've had so many experiences of young people trying to negotiate that. In my experience, 9 times out of 10, holiday is non-negotiable. So save yourselves the trouble and use your ammunition to instead negotiate for something else. So what would you want to negotiate for? Let me give you a hint. definitely money, right? How do you negotiate that? Instead of negotiating your salary, it's very common in China to negotiate instead for a quarterly bonus. This quarterly bonus is most of the time assessed based on your performance by your manager. So let me give you an example. My partner, who works at one of the big gaming companies, around 25% of his income is based on quarterly bonus. And that is part of the negotiation process when he is getting his contract locked down. It takes time for you to go through that process, but trust me, it's worth investing into. And finally, for a lot of you guys who have experience working in a Western large corporation, you might be very used to the idea of getting private healthcare, dentistry, maybe even, I don't know, maybe even opportunities for your kids to go to a school locally, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of Chinese companies are still struggling to get to that level in terms of offering welfare. So when you're thinking about what you're going to spend money on, so when you're thinking about negotiating your salary, you really have to look in the contract to see if the things that really matter to you, like private healthcare, is actually made available. If it's not, you need to be thinking about, oh, I have to pay for that on a monthly basis. So I don't know how many of you guys think about this on a day-to-day basis. Hopefully that was a little bit helpful to you. And finally, cross-cultural communication, how to work with your Chinese colleagues and how to work with your Chinese boss. Now, let's first start with how to work with your Chinese boss. This has been a very interesting part of my career in China. It is very difficult. Of course, everyone's very different. I'm only going to share my own personal experiences. This does not represent, you know, every single CEO out there. I would say, generally speaking, for Chinese CEOs who are based around the age of 40, 50, 60, so basically 40 and above, they are very hierarchical, authoritative, top down. So when it comes to the CEO walking in the room and making decisions, when it comes to the CEO always getting the final check before any document is sent out, this is taken very seriously in a Chinese company. Of course, I've also seen startups with younger CEOs, younger Chinese bosses, and younger Chinese managers who are much more adaptable and fluid. However, one of the key challenges for these young managers is how do they manage in an open communication way to those who are perhaps being managed by them, their direct report, but using a very different style when they need to manage upwards because their CEOs, their bosses are of the age group of 40 and above, of what I meant, which is what I mentioned to you earlier. It's important for you to remember that a lot of slightly older Chinese managers are very indirect when it comes to the way in which they want to communicate with you. What this means is often they may not give you feedback on what they like and what they don't like directly to your face. Instead, they will nod in a meeting room. They will really think about it and they'll say, okay, this looks okay. Thanks for showing me this presentation. You walk out and you think to yourself, wow, that went really well. I didn't get any feedback at all. He didn't say anything about the content. Usually that implicit communication means probably you need to double check using formal communication style. So for example, an email or maybe a text message to your boss, or maybe going back to the manager that you have presented to and check and say, hey, could I get your feedback written down? Could I get your feedback in a formal style? This is so important because Chinese CEOs, in my experience, Chinese bosses, in my experience, they don't like to say no to your face. So one thing is happening up there for them and something totally different is happening for you. And that disconnection I have seen have tripped up a lot of different team members I've worked with in the past. Now, cross-cultural communication with your Chinese co-workers. In general, young people in China, when it comes to the work environment, are very informal. So they dress in a very informal way, t-shirt, shorts, trainers. They're not doing the whole Wolf of Wall Street suit. That's not their style, okay? But at the same time, they're very informal in the way that they want to talk to you about, hey, what did you have for lunch? Hey, what are you doing after work? Hey, do you want to hang out maybe? Because for young Chinese people, the boundary between work and life is very, very fluid. This is great because it's a great way for you guys to make lots of friends when you come to Shanghai. Of course, it's a disadvantage. It means that you can sometimes be on call via one of the main apps that we use here in China called Wechat 24/7 because of that boundary being very blurred. This is very important for you to think about ahead of time. If this makes you feel uncomfortable, when you are joining your new team, you need to sit down with your boss and explain to your boss, hey, in my experience, I like to be communicated in this way. I like to receive emails. I like to receive 1 week's notice. If this doesn't work for you and this is uncomfortable for you, how can we work better together? Let's talk this out before we start. I have received so many different interns at RADII who have come from a very different cultural background. And when they get here, they struggle a lot with the work and life boundary. So I strongly recommend for you to think about that and spend time communicating with your managers about that.
I want to also note a couple of quick things. So this graph here is from a very old professor named Hofstede, and he did a lot of research on cross-cultural differences in terms of work culture, how they emphasize masculinity or individualism. And you'll notice here that China in these studies was ranked very low on individualism, which means that the Chinese work culture tends to really promote an emphasis on the group dynamic. So making sure that you get along with everyone in the group, making sure that there's not a lot of conflict. Something like harmony is a word that's used a lot. And at the same time, there's a really high emphasis on a long-term orientation. What that means is that people consider the people they work with like their family in a way. If they're people that you'll see every day, you often see them working what we call 996. 996 stands for working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. That's a very common working schedule, especially if you're at a fast-growing startup or a tech company. So we can't say that this is true for all Chinese companies. Of course, there's lots of diversity, and of course, every company has their own culture. But when you look at when you examine Chinese culture on sort of a generalized scale, these are some of the trends or patterns that you might come to see, especially if you start working at many different companies, or if you work for a more traditional company. So that's something to note, is that just to be ready for some of these cultural differences. It's likely that you might run into some of these issues, and it's probably more normal here than in other places to be working long hours. People are not afraid of working those long hours. So that's something that we wanted to just sort of flag as a potential issue if you choose to work in China or with a Chinese company. So what do we do with all this information? What are some next steps that we can take? I think for those of us that are outside of China, there are many ways that we can educate ourselves about China and to learn more about these cultural differences and learn more about opportunities. So on the left here, we have Digitally China. That's a podcast that RADII it's something that we host on our platform. And we try to tell stories about, what are the stories of the fastest growing companies? What are stories about the protests against the 996 work culture? That was one of our stories from last year that was very popular. This is a great podcast series. There's also articles about these topics on our website. So that's something you can find on your podcast platform of your choice. Another great podcast we like to recommend is called the China Marketing Podcast. This is an interview series between different leading marketers who deal with either Chinese clients or work at Chinese big companies, and basically give you insights on how do marketers work across these different cultures. These are great English language podcasts that help you gain better insight on China. That second one is hosted by one of our friends, SubChina, that's based, another media company that's based in New York. If you want some reading material, we have lots of it. We have over 3,000 articles on Chinese culture, life, and innovation. This covers everything from, what are young artists doing to, the sports scene, the e-gaming scene, the music scene, social issues like Lee mentioned, LGBTQ rights, or why people are, climate change, why people are having babies later and later, things like that. These are macro trends that we think are really important to highlight. And then lastly, we also have a wide range of video content. So you can find that on our YouTube or Instagram channels. We try to explain different slang coming out of China. We have a documentary series called RADII Voices that talks about what it's like to be a young creative in China. And then we have an explainer series. So we try to explain the different trends and kind of interesting historical stories that have some relationship to China. Last but not least, we want to invite you to keep in touch. So you can feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn and message us about anything that you've heard about today. You can also follow us on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and also Wechat. So we're happy to continue the conversation. We want to know why you care about China. You might feel scared, you might feel nervous, but you also might be really excited about the opportunities. You might be overwhelmed by all the things we've talked about today. So whatever that feedback is, we'd love to hear it. In the next couple of days, we'll send you a survey to kind of hear about your thoughts and your follow-up questions. And we'd also love to keep in touch and share more opportunities for you. So if we hear about an interesting fellowship program or a new job opportunity or a new startup accelerator, we would love to share that news with you. So that's what we had planned for prepared remarks. Now we want to open it up to the Q&A section. We'll take a quick look at the questions in the chat room. Let me see here.
I think we gave you guys maybe too much information. It was perhaps information overload.
So let's start at the top here. So let's see. So one of the questions was, can you get out of the 2-year work requirement if you already have a master's degree? That's a great question. So I did a 2 years master's at Zhejiang University in Hangzhou, and the new work visa policy had just come out. So you get extra points for having a master's degree, and you get extra points if you have a degree from a top university, whether that's in China or abroad. Now, how exactly they define a top university is a subject of debate and can change every year. When I was applying, I needed to prove that I was an honors graduate. So that not only did I graduate from a top university, but I also needed to prove that I had a great GPA and the school gave me an outstanding graduate certificate. And so that helped me get out of the 2-year work experience requirement, which I didn't have at the time. So it's really on a case-by-case basis, and it sometimes depends on the city. So I was a level, so they have 3 categories of work visas. You're either A, B, or C tier, and A is reserved for people who are considered experts in a field or a world-famous athlete. Somebody like Jeremy Lin, who just joined the Beijing Ducks. He would be an A-level foreigner to get that status. In Shanghai, I'm considered a B-level worker, which is somebody who's white collar, doing some sort of white collar job and is a needed talent for that company. And then there's C-level. This is considered, it depends on the city, but it's considered work that is less valuable or can be easily filled by Chinese locals. And when I moved from Shanghai to Shenzhen, the Shenzhen government would only give me a C-level permit because I was too young. I was 25 at the time. So there are a lot of differences between each city, and you need to reapply for a work visa every time you move cities. It's easier if you already have one, so you can transfer it, but it still requires a new card. This is all to say that when you actually apply, if you are a master's student right now, you should definitely try to get in touch with either a visa agent, or if your HR department's experienced with helping foreigners get work visas, you should be asking them. It really is a case-by-case process, and you need to collect a lot of different documents to prove that you have enough points to get the permit.
It's a slightly complicated process, which is one of the reasons why I mentioned to you guys earlier, before you jump in too deep with any company, you have to make sure that that company has experience in supporting you through, because it sometimes takes up to 6 months for you to get your visa documents in line. And the company needs to provide an insane amount of documentation to support you. So if they don't have it and they don't have the experience and they're not willing to fork out the money, then there's no need to even have this discussion with them, right? So get that information written down for you as soon as possible. One thing I want to mention, as I earlier talked a little bit about salary negotiation and contracting, I want to highlight to you guys. It's very normal in China that you don't sign for your full-time employment contract until the day you start your job. So what this means is that there are two types of contract. There's one type of contract that's essentially intent. I want this job, I'm going to quit my current job, I'm going to come to China, and we're going to make this work. And then your full-time employment contract actually starts the day, your first day, basically the Monday that you arrive, let's say hypothetically. This sometimes can be quite nerve-wracking for a lot of foreigners who are coming to China for the first time. If this is you, you need to make sure that you're building a strong relationship with the HR department, and they are helping you every single step of the way. Do not underestimate how many times you have to go back and forth with documentation to get this done.
And there was another question about whether medium-sized companies would be willing to hire foreigners. I think absolutely yes. The tricky thing is, yeah, like Lee mentioned, one, do they have experience doing this? It's much more difficult and expensive to hire a foreigner than a local. So some companies might not be willing to put in that work. And the second thing is, are they giving out these work visas, or are they trying to hire you on a different visa? So you might hear that a lot of people in China, foreigners in China, will be working off of a student visa or a business visa or a tourist visa. And those cases are prevalent, but technically it's illegal, right? Technically, if you look at the visa restrictions, if you're on a student visa, for example, you should not be taking any full-time employment. There are some loopholes for internships and things like that, but in general, these things are not great practices, right? And so you want to make sure that the company is able to sponsor a full working visa so that you have legal status. If they're not willing to, then sometimes there are ways that you can have a business visa issued by their office in another country. So if their US office is giving you a business visa and the Chinese office invites you, then you can work for 60 days at a time. There are arrangements like that can work. But again, you should err on the side of caution and really look up the legality and also check with an agent or the HR department.
Yeah, as you guys can tell by how much time we're spending on explaining this to you, it's very complicated. You need friends who are going to support you. One group of question that I'm seeing really is about how you go about applying for the job, or let's say identifying the opportunity and then applying for it. Let me be honest, a lot of medium-sized Chinese companies, even if there is a need for a foreigner, they're not very good at putting the job up on platforms. LinkedIn in China has only really taken off in the last 12 months, if not less. I've only started seeing a lot of young Chinese people going on LinkedIn really in the last 6 months or so. What this means is that the normal platforms that you guys would want to use in order to show the credibility of your CV is something that's not usually used in China. So unless you're going for one of the big companies like Alibaba, Tencent, ByteDance, unless you're going for them, I would actually recommend for you to reach out to the medium-sized companies with your CV and with a cover letter. Here are a few important things that medium-sized companies will always want to know. One, your education level, because your education level increases the points in the visa system. We already talked about this. Two, why you want to come to China. How committed are you? Because a lot, like as we talked about, a lot of getting you a visa requires investment of money. So if they think you're just coming here to have a little bit of fun, see what Shanghai is like, hang out in Beijing, which you're entitled to do, but a medium-sized company will think that's too much risk. So you need to sell them, I'm here to grow my career, to develop this relationship, and I want to be fully embedded in this community. The third thing is whether or not you speak Chinese. If you speak Chinese, how good is your Chinese? Are you able to hold a meeting in Chinese? For me, that's a threshold. It's not about your HSK level, to be honest with you. It's really about to what extent can you sit in a meeting with a client or with the internal team and understand what is going on. Because I will say this, hands up, that unfortunately, a lot of young Chinese people, even though we speak really good English, we could do it, still choose to speak Chinese in a meeting. Right. So that is a huge challenge.
And I think one of the follow-up questions to this is from Catherine. How much are people interested in foreigners at this time? It's a great question. There was a time in March and April where China started to blame foreigners for bringing the virus back. And there was a lot of sort of anti-foreigner sentiment at that point. There were examples of certain foreigners not being able to return to their apartments. One of the stories that we reported on was Africans in Guangzhou were getting kicked out of their apartments and put into quarantine without their consent. So there have been instances of anti-foreign sentiment. However, I would say that right now, especially in the past few months, China has closed off its borders to all foreigners. So there are a lot of industries, especially in the education industry, where there used to be a lot of foreign teachers that no longer can come back in. Which means that once the borders reopen, we're thinking in the next 3 or 4 months, at that point, there will be a lot of vacancies. And so if you were looking for a job, that would be the best time to apply. It'll be a little competitive, but there will be a need for foreigners who can speak English, who can speak other languages. It just really depends on the industry that you're looking into.
I would also say that it depends a lot on where you want to live, right? We live in Shanghai, our company's in Shanghai, and I would say in general, Shanghai is a very cosmopolitan, open city. And I think the same goes for the major cities around China you've heard of before: Beijing, Shenzhen, Chongqing, Chengdu, Nanjing, etc. Once you start taking jobs at a slightly smaller city, you need to think about the quality of life the local infrastructure can offer you as a foreigner. So in terms of food, in terms of local communities, local events that are in line with your interests and hobbies, it's really worthwhile investing into it by maybe joining some local WeChat groups. This actually would be the #1 tip I give all of you guys today. If you do not currently have WeChat, download WeChat. Reach out to somebody in the group who perhaps are in other communities on WeChat already, other WeChat groups. Get them to add you so you can have a look and see what people in that city are talking about. What's opening, what's closing, what are the events, what's the live music scene like, and really get to know what people there like to do and whether or not that suits you. I don't want to answer any more questions about visas and kind of issues to do with that. If you guys are really interested in visas, then maybe perhaps Brian and I can prepare a separate session on this, because we've now answered a lot. We've spent a lot of time talking about this. I think Rich, who is on the China mission side, could maybe even help you guys talk a little bit more about visas and student visas and etc. One interesting question I saw earlier is about the NGO sector in China. This is, I would say, a little bit of a gray area in China. I personally know a lot of fantastic mission-driven organizations that do great work. However, most of the time, they're not registered as NGOs because it is very, very, very difficult to register as an NGO in China. It is not an industry that you see a lot of foreigners or even a lot of young people starting up their own organizations in. So what I would suggest is if you're interested in NGOs, don't search for NGOs. Instead, try and find a company or an organization that help you achieve your mission and reach out to them about volunteering, perhaps as part of their program, or perhaps getting an internship there to learn a little bit more about what they do before you commit yourself. But if you're searching for NGO, you're searching the wrong keywords. Should we take a few more?
Sure.
One more?
Yeah, we have about 10 more minutes. Let's see. So I guess in terms of, there's a lot of questions here about how to source new opportunities. So we had a slide back during our presentation talking about different job boards. I think one other thing you could consider is talk to, the Chinese people in your community, people who, if you haven't made the jump yet to China, then reach out to the Chinese people in your community and ask them about their, what do they know? Where are they from? Like I said, I think a lot of there's a huge amount of diversity between different cities. And so if you have a friend who, was born and raised in Hangzhou, they're gonna know a lot about that city and know a lot about what's happening and who's hiring. So a lot of Chinese networking happens through something called guanxi. Guanxi is, you could translate it as relationships, but essentially it means helping out people that right? Having that influence. And I think that tapping into that is probably the number one most direct way to get connected to things. I think in China it's still quite common for people to hire friends of friends or friends of family, people that they know they can vet through trust. People don't really want to just look at 100 random resumes and pick somebody, right? Of course you can always do that. Of course you can always apply through job boards, but I think something is to be said about leveraging your network and leveraging your friend group. I think that's especially important in China, even more so than in other countries. If you're already in China, then there's a lot of local expat boards. So I'm sure if you've heard of some of these, like in Shanghai, we have Smart Shanghai. In Beijing, you might go to That's Beijing. They all have their own job boards for local opportunities. So that would be another way to find different openings.
Right. I'm going to answer a question about Chinese returnees. I'll keep this brief. Obviously, I'm in that category. Right now, it's a really, really good time for, I would say, if you are, part of the Chinese diaspora and you are considering coming back to China, right now is a very good time. A couple of things to be aware of. I won't go on too much about the advantages because I'm sure they are very apparent to you. Let's talk about some of the challenges you might face. First thing is your Chinese level. Because you are a Chinese returnee, people will assume your Chinese is very, very good. So if it's not very, very good, I would suggest you invest some time into making sure your Chinese level goes from, family dinner conversation to meeting, hosting, hierarchical business discussion Chinese. That's really important because there's an assumption when people see you when it comes to what they expect. I went through that process. And I actually, when I got back, spent about a year learning business Chinese because I realized when I walk into the room, that's what people expect of me. One additional thing I want to mention about returnees is that I think I've had, how do I say that? I've had friends in the past who are returnees who've struggled quite a lot with reintegrating back into the local community here. What I mean by this is young people who have perhaps spent 15 or maybe even 20 years outside of China, when they suddenly come back to China, they can still feel a little bit alienated because the culture that they're used to thriving in is not necessarily what's happening here on the ground. So what I would suggest is if that's you and you're a returnee coming back to China, take your time. Don't expect to be able to jump straight back in just because you have this cultural connection with China. It's not as easy as you think because of the expectations.
It's a competitive landscape for sure. And one of the things that, you know, aside from improving your language, let's say you're looking to pick up other skills, there's lots, I mean, China's full of opportunity of interesting things. One thing that comes to mind is like a coding boot camp, for example. There's a program called Wagon, which they have programs operating out of Shanghai and Beijing and Chengdu. And that would be another interesting way to build up a separate skill while living in China. And of course, you know, there's a lot of questions about how to gain more experience in China, coming to study, applying for fellowships, doing research, teaching. These are all great ways to start off if you're looking for a way. We have just a few minutes left. There are a lot of questions about where to find we've covered so many things, where to find these resources and links. We would love to, you know, share those links and put them together as a document, as a resource. So we can certainly follow up with that in the next few days. And we'll be following up with a survey to kind of get more feedback and to hear your thoughts and continue this conversation. So we will absolutely stay in touch. Let me just really quickly put our information back on the screen. And so, yeah, like I said, mentioned earlier, please feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn and follow us on social media. I know it's, at least for here, it's late on Saturday night. So thank you so much for your time. You know, it's great to speak with all of you. Lee, do you have any other final remarks?
I guess one thing I do want to say is it's not easy. No matter who you are, no matter whether you're a Chinese returnee or you are somebody who's studying in China or you are a foreigner who's come to China for the first time, but it's so fun. It's full of adventure. It's full of surprises. It is both chaotic and inspiring to be in a place that's fast-paced and changing, and people here are courageous when it comes to making business decisions and starting their own adventures, and you should do it. So stop thinking about it and start taking action. And we will talk about maybe doing something like this again in a few weeks, and I don't know, maybe support you guys in another way. We haven't done this before, so I'm not sure how well that went. So we'll talk about it, and if you guys liked it and if you think it went well, then yeah, maybe we'll do something similar and answer a few of these questions in detail and help you in a small way. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. All right, we'll be in touch. Bye-bye,
Bye.
everyone.